Slyke, and I'm one of the content editors with the Law Review. We really appreciated having all of you here today and sharing, this discussion with you. Our panelists today, we have Todd Aker from Villanova Law School in Pennsylvania. He will be discussing how issues are framed and social psychology's role in that. Jeff Cook is an energy policy and market analyst at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory in Golden, Colorado. And Jeff will be discussing local government's influence on the energy market and the processes and rulemaking that go into that. Steve Smutko is coming from the University of Wyoming. He is a professor and Spicer Chair of Collaborative Practice. He's also with the Hobbs School of Environment and Natural Resources, and he's with the Department of Agriculture and Applied Economics. Steve will be discussing NEPA and incentivizing social licensing in different situations. And our last panelist will be Justin Pideaux, who is currently a professor at the University of Denver Sturm College of Law. And he'll be discussing partnership decisions between businesses and agencies at the end of the Obama administration. And lastly, we have Professor Sandra Zellmer, our distinguished visiting professor from the University of Nebraska School of Law, who will be moderating. So please join me in welcoming our next panel.
Thanks, Emily, and thanks all of the students. I know you've heard this a few times, but I wanted to say it myself as well. Thank you all for everything you've done. It's so exciting to be at a place where public lands are featured, both in the class that I teach and in the interests of the students and of this institution, more broadly speaking. So between the Law Review and the field trips and the great deal of enthusiasm for open spaces and state and federal public lands and tribal natural resources issues, it's just been a blast to be here, and looking forward to having a wonderful year for the rest of the time that I am here. Emily did a great job of teeing us up in terms of who the speakers are and what generally we'll be speaking about. I won't take up too much time, but we are planning on taking our entire 90 minutes. I will be a fierce timekeeper, though, in hopes that we can reserve some time for Q&A. I think that that's always one of the most stimulating and valuable parts of any conference, and we're hoping to make room for that here this afternoon. I wanted to just say a couple more things about each of our panelists. Both Todd and Justin Pideaux have something in common both with each other and with me. They both previously served at United States Department of Justice, Environment and Natural Resources Division. Both of them were, just a few years after me, but nonetheless, we are colleagues in that sense. Something that you didn't know about Justin is that you heard during Charles Wilkinson's talk just a few minutes ago that he was with Department of Interior in the Solicitor's Office as a Deputy Solicitor for Lands and Resources during the Bears Ears talks, and at the time the executive order was signed on the Bears Ears National Monument and had a role to play in many of the other national monuments. But what you didn't know about Justin is that before he got his law school, he was a field biologist in Silvergate, Montana for Yellowstone ecosystem studies. So he is, I know that he's happy to be back in Montana, although Missoula is a fairly new experience to him. A couple of things I want to say both about Jeff and about Steve. Jeff Cook, it was too humble to put this in his bio, but while pursuing his PhD at Colorado State University in Fort Collins, he received CSU's Distinguished Professor's Scholarship and continues to do great work on renewable energy policy at the National Renewable Energy Lab. And although I'm taking these out of order, Emily gave them to you in order. Our third speaker, but last but not least on the roster today, for my purposes, is Steve Smutko, the Spicer Chair at Wyoming's Hobbs School of Environment and Natural Resources. He has done some very interesting things that will just by mentioning them in passing, will give us some sense of how deeply he has been involved in collaborative, sustainable decision-making processes. He serves on the Western Governors Associations on Species Conservation and the ESA. Never any controversial issues arising there like sagebrush. And Wyoming is just such a quiet and sort of complacent place when it comes to species conservation and the Endangered Species Act, right? And he also serves on the task force, the Wyoming Task Force on Forests, travel management and forestry and other related issues. So that all feeds into the overarching theme for this particular panel. These panelists will explore how cultural cognition and values, going back to something that Professor Benson said this morning, we need to take greater recognition and integration of values in our natural resources management, whether it be hydropower dams or otherwise. Here they'll be talking about how cultural cognition and values blend in sustainable energy practice. When conservation initiatives are so often polarizing and sometimes completely debilitated by biases, mistrust, lack of transparency, this panel will be exploring how we can build an Inca bridge, to borrow from Greg Smith's talk earlier this morning as well, a bridge out of many strands of grass, and how we can take those strands of grass to build a more transparent, trusting, and effective sustainable energy policy. So with that, our first speaker, Todd.
So Sandy set up very well, I think, both the whole panel and what I want to talk about, because it seems to me that both energy development and public lands are two areas where there's a lot of political divisiveness, indicative maybe of the broader political divisiveness that we have in the country these days. And so, excellent. So these are just a few quotes I pulled of different people from different perspectives talking about their position on public lands. And you can see, and certainly I'm not suggesting that this is, that everybody who feels and comments about public lands necessarily speaks like this, but it was very easy to find these examples among the various comments and quotes about public lands, but a lot of name calling, calling environmentalists bunny lovers and rock lickers, accusing people of ignorance, selfishness, greed, lack of patriotism, even talking about renewable energy development as scenic desecration, lots of things with exclamation points. They only care about big oil money, right? Like, this is not indicative of people, of I think what our hopes are really for public deliberation. And so, so what do we want out of public participation in decision-making about, in general, and in particular about energy development and public lands? I think most people agree with the first point, that it should be an important part of the decision-making, but exactly why maybe is not as clear. And so here are some of the benefits that have been identified. This is not my list. I think most of these were taken from a National Academy of Sciences report. Some of these are fairly obvious, I think. So the idea that public participation improves decision quality. And so here you may think of, there's information that the public has that the decision maker doesn't, that getting that information will help the government decision maker make a better decision. Public participation improves decision legitimacy. The idea that the public has been heard, has had its day, and been consulted, gives maybe some buy-in from the public from the ultimate outcome of the decision. You'll notice as we get down this list, we're sort of further afield from the precise, specific decision under consideration and going to more broader, longer-term benefits. So next would be the idea that by participating in a decision-making process, the public is not just educated about that particular issue, but actually gains some knowledge and expertise that it can use in other issues as well, and so for future decision-making. So sort of once public has participated in one decision, the next time, and the next time, and the next time, they'll be a better advocate and a better participant in decision-making. And I think very broadly, public participation should be a crucial part of our democracy process. And that's really what I want to focus on is, sorry, I got you. Is the role of public participation, and public participation here as not just focused on the particular individual decision being made, but on how public participation can be democracy promoting and maybe help address some of these political divides that we see. I'm approaching this from the vantage point of a lot of social science research that has looked at public participation and criticized it for misunderstanding how the public deliberates about decisions. And what this has shown, and some of this is from theories called cultural cognition theory, social identity theory, different disciplines have arrived at really the same understanding, which is that people disagree not about facts, but about values. And so if you and I disagree about a particular policy position, that's more likely rooted in a disagreement about the values that we associate with those positions than about the specific facts that are under consideration. This manifests itself in a really difficult and interesting way, because what this means is that when people hear a fact about a policy position, they don't approach that fact from a neutral, oh, I just want to know what the facts are and then I will decide what I want to do. Instead, we have a filter, a value-based filter when we hear information, and just like we try to organize everything in life, when the light goes green, the traffic will start, we organize our life and we try to put things in boxes. And so even before we actually get any real information or pay attention to the facts that we're hearing, we try to put a policy issue in a box. Oh, this is about the federal government intruding on local authority. Oh, this is about rampant economic development that's going to damage the environment. And so what actually happens is that instead of facts breaking down some of these people's opinions, we very quickly put things in a box and actually just reject facts that don't abide with whatever the way we've organized our facts. And so adding facts, which most of us probably think of as a way of figuring out what we should do, turns out to be entirely opposite. It actually entrenches people in their pre-existing value-based position to the point that they become more and more entrenched and less open to dialogue and talking with other people and trying to bridge these divides that we're talking about. What I want to focus on specifically is the ways in which framing an issue is part of that cognitive process. And so we all understand that framing, and as lawyers, certainly this is something we spend a lot of time doing, right, is how does framing an issue affect how people think about it? But adding onto that this layer of value-based opinion formation, we can see that what framing does is it sends a signal to the recipient of the message about what values they should associate with that policy position. I would go back and forth, but I don't want to.
You can.
I can go back. So one more forward.
Okay. One more forward.
Okay, so here are some examples of ways that energy-based or public lands-based decisions have been framed. And I think you can see the way that the different advocates are trying to associate different values with really what turns out to be the same issue. So earth justice, our nation's public lands, including vulnerable landscapes, are being threatened by destructive fossil fuel-driven energy development, right? Like very much trying to associate this issue with, do you care about protecting public lands from destruction, and making that association so that they are hopeful that what you will feel is protective of public lands in a very defensive of public lands way, and see any sort of energy development as sort of inherently destructive and something that you would impose. Next to the Wilderness Society, which takes a slightly different tack on it, energy development should be done away from sensitive areas and near degraded areas. So not taking as the strong sort of stance that Earth Justice is taking, but more of a where should this happen, and the idea that there are areas that are sensitive and there are areas that are degraded, and really it's only the degraded areas that should be appropriate for energy development. And then finally, the American Petroleum Institute talking about multiple use, negligible interference, managed in a manner, right? They're trying to associate energy development with, this is a thoughtful process, this can be done with negligible interference. Don't worry about this, it's going to be okay. Okay?
Go back.
Yeah, okay. So I think you can see from these examples that the way you frame an issue is really a way of associating certain values. And so much of the competition that you see among interest groups is what value association should you make with a particular message, in the hopes that they can sort of get buy-in from you, that your whatever pre-existing values you hold will lead you to a position that supports their position. So energy development on public, so all those observations I think are true of basically any public policy issue on which people have opinions. I think energy development on public lands poses particular challenges in this regard. So these are disputes that have a real long historical background. These have been divisive for generations, many of them. Some of the interest groups are very, very well organized. So when you get an issue about public lands, you're sort of stepping into not new territory, but territory that people feel like they already understand well and already have a lot of value association. Historical disputes, and not only that, but very traditional uses from all backgrounds, right? So both extractive industries, Native Americans, recreation uses, a lot of these have long traditions, and people associate that not with just their own personal preference, but really being part of a cultural background. On top of this, you have public land statutes that don't really make strong value hierarchies, right? So the whole idea of multiple use is kind of, here's a whole bunch of things, public land agencies that you should be balancing, and not necessarily, with some exceptions, of course, not necessarily creating a hierarchy of what values should be preferred over others, so sort of everything is up for grabs from the position of the agency. You have participation processes that traditionally have been more oriented towards gathering information than from the sort of values-based discussion, and so isn't necessarily the best forum for this value-based discussion. Also uncertainty as to on what scale are we talking about? Are we talking about local, what's the impact right here, who's going to get a job or lose a job? Are we talking about global, climate change? A lot of uncertainty there about how you define it. I think most of the rest I'll skip forward in the interest of time. So I think the idea that I would say that could be a source of some cautious optimism is the idea that interest groups can frame things in a way that is disruptive of existing patterns of value association. That unlike those, the examples that I gave before of framing that were very much reiterating what existing patterns of associations people have, sometimes you can frame a way that makes people have a different association than what's expected and maybe make them or invite them into a more deliberation about what side they should be on, given the way that it's been framed. So here's two examples that I'll offer before I complete. One, a recent article in the New York Times about ways in which coal miners who are unemployed because of the decline of coal and the mechanization in the coal industry are actually very good candidates for working in renewable energy projects like wind towers and solar panels. And so this is changing the narrative of war on coal through renewable energy development to one more of economic development, but through a different path maybe that people are thinking of. The next one is not an energy example, but this is a project that's in the Payette National Forest in Idaho, where there's a new gold mine that is being proposed, and but it's on lands that have been previously damaged by historical gold mining. And so the project proponent has framed this as a matter of environmental restoration, that they are going to create the resources necessary to clean up the land even as they develop a new mine. And I was interested to see that to the point that the environmental opposition to the mine is not there shouldn't be a mine at all, but they have actually agreed with the frame that Midas Gold has adopted and said, yeah, they're actually kind of right about this, and so what our debates should be are what are the conditions, what should the size of the mine be? But they basically have agreed with the project proponent that this is going to be an environmental benefit. This is going to be a win-win in that sense of both the resource extraction and the environmental benefit. So overall, I think the hope would be here that all the participants in public deliberation should maybe take this idea of disruptive framing and potentially employ it to their advantage. And unfortunately, I think that at least a lot of what I see from interest groups seem to be speaking to the people that are already on their side, which is good for fundraising, but not necessarily good for public deliberation. And so what I would hope is that interest groups could see an opportunity not just to rally their pre-existing supporters, but actually to gain support from people that would feel like they're on their other side and do it through this disruptive framing technique. What I would also hope is that on the government side, that both agencies and courts would more consciously create fora for this sort of value-based deliberation. And so a lot of what you see through things like NEPA processes and litigation is a very sort of rational scientific framework that focuses very much on information. And the idea would be that even though there is certainly a space for that, that there also needs to be a space for this values-based deliberation, because that's the basis on which people form their beliefs. Thank you very much.
Hi everybody, I'm Jeff. It's great to be here today to talk about something that's near and dear to my heart, which is local and state voices in renewable deployment. In particular today, we're going to talk about policymakers. I apologize, there's a lot of slides, so we're going to do a lot of clicking today, but we can go to the next one.
We got one that works.
Oh,
so.
sure. Well, save the day. All right, perfect.
So it's the play button.
Or
not.
Okay.
Well,
We
just
try our
did
best.
work. Yeah. Never mind.
But we can go to the next slide, and we can actually go to the next one too. It's important to have a little background today. We've talked a little bit about it in general from some of the other panels, so I don't have to spend a lot of time on that. But what I do want to say about federal policy is that they manage wholesale markets. In particular, a lot of the debate we're having right now about valuing different energy sources is important, and states are talking about that as well, so we'll circle back. Today we're going to talk about state and local policy. States manage everything within a state. RPS policies are one of the historic drivers of renewable deployment that they've used. Local governments manage the siting and permitting of projects within their community. They also have significant control over or oversight over what types of, how they build their economy or try to diversify that. And something we're not going to talk about today at all really is voluntary markets. There's a lot of push from corporations, for example, to procure their own renewable energy. And as you can see in the figure, it's increasing in recent years. Something to look at even into the future. So we can go to the next slide. So what are some of the key drivers of why state policymakers might be considering renewable energy? The biggest one is economic development. So every RPS standard, not every RPS standard, but a lot of them have an economic development driver in them. That's one of the reasons why they passed these in the first place. And that is because renewable energy can have project and manufacturing benefits for the localities or the states that have them. And so capturing that benefit is important to states as a way to diversify their economies. It also offers cleaner generation. We're all very much aware of that. The other that we might not be is the idea that it increases competition and consumer choice. So here the important thing to remember is that as renewable energy costs decline, they're becoming more competitive with natural gas and coal, providing utilities with a better or more options for procuring energy. And in terms of consumer choice, because renewable energy allows for on-site generation for a lot more, for both corporations and individual customers, it gives those customers more freedom to choose where their energy comes from, and that's also why we're seeing more corporate procurement of renewables, particularly as costs decline. There are concerns, right, with renewable energy, and they influence, or they needed to be balanced with maybe some of the benefits. And so there are some local impacts in terms of environmental concerns. If you think about solar, it happens a lot in the desert Southwest. Desert ecosystems are very fragile, so there are problems there. Wind turbines and bats is another problem. But wind turbines typically deal more with viewshed issues, and the concerns, if you put your wind turbines on a hillside, that might impact people's view of a natural landscape, and they may be disappointed with that. They also may support wind generation in general, but not in their backyard. It fits in with that viewshed issue. Another problem or trade-off is, though we're seeing a lot more renewable energy jobs, as was just brought up, they're not exactly dispersed geographically equally, right? So places where you see a lot of coal mining jobs, the map on the right there is where solar jobs are. Darker states, more solar jobs. Lighter states, fewer solar jobs. You can see in states like Montana, there aren't quite as many jobs in just this industry, and so it goes to show that as you might displace some historical fuels, those jobs may not be in the same places. Also, renewable energy deals with variability, right? The sun's not always shining, and that can cause grid concerns. We'll talk about that in the slides that follow. And so states and localities deal with these issues differently, and we're going to talk about that on this next slide, particularly starting with states and then turning to local governments as well. So on the state side, you have both legislators and regulators that deal with policy decisions. And the key driver, as I mentioned at the beginning, was RPS standards that were the main reason why we saw a lot of renewable deployment in the 90s and early 2000s. Currently, RPS standards cover 56% of the market, to give you a sense, the national market. But outside of that, states have actually done a lot in the renewable energy space to incentivize or promote this type of energy. And we're going to go to the next slide and talk about one of those specifically that gets back to my previous comment about using renewable energy as an economic development driver. So the top figure on the left is all, this is some NREL work, I should probably have stated that too, where NREL looked at all of the economic development policies that states have used to foster the expansion of manufacturing within their state. And so every state on the top left, though you can't quite see it, has more than one economic development related policy. These could be financial incentives for incentivizing manufacturers to come to their state. It might be legislation on workforce training for a particular set of skills, or even going to the extent of developing a new agency that manages economic development specifically for commercializing renewable energy technology. And the figure on the bottom right then actually shows the states that have a financial incentive to get clean energy companies to come to their state. Montana has one related to property taxes. And so that gives you a sense of what states have done in this one space to capture the opportunities from clean energy manufacturing, i.e. developing wind turbine components or solar panels, stuff like that. So then what do local governments do in this space, right? So we know that, well, we've determined that local governments use three main pathways to deploy renewable energy, and that's including it in their plans, programs, and code to foster that development. Something that we've seen more recently is the target or goal of cities to include or reach for 100% renewable energy target. It's like a bunch of mini RPSs across the states. We can go back for 1 second. You're doing a great job though. So in some states where you have a lot of population in these cities, these targets can then influence state markets. If you look at, you can't really tell, but California, Michigan, and New York have a significant cluster of them. Now, having said that, these are goals for 100% RE. They're not necessarily mandated, whereas when you put things in municipal code, that generally means you have more policy certainty that you're going to achieve that, goal, commitment, program objective, what have you. Now we can go to the next one. And so NREL has actually looked at the extent of municipal codification of particular clean energy keywords. And so there's a lot going on in this figure, but there's two things I want you to know. The darker green states show that of the sample that we had, 50 to 75 to 100% of municipalities in that state with populations larger than 2,000 reference at least one of these clean energy keywords in their code. And so states or municipalities are doing that. The other thing I wanted to point out is just that the yellow represents solar, so a lot of them talk about solar in particular. And so we can go to the next slide. So now that we kind of run through a little bit about what state and local governments do in the clean energy space, let's talk about some of the key struggles or debates they're having today. And so we'll go to the next one where we'll talk about state policy first. So we've talked at some length about RPS policy to this point, and states have often debated the cost of that policy. And NREL actually came out with a report that sort of maps out what that is. That's the figure to the right. The small bar, if you can't see it, is the cost, whether it increases costs or decreases costs, and then you have the benefits there on the right of those RPS standards. So what it shows basically is that with existing RPS standards, electrical system costs may be a bit higher than they otherwise would be across the country or the places that have it. But in the future, these costs might decline as RPSs increase, which some states are considering, because, as I mentioned before, renewable energy costs are declining significantly at utility scale. Now, at the very beginning of this, I mentioned this valuing of energy piece, and I'd like to bring that up here again as well. So just like the federal government is evaluating or is reviewing how we value energy generation in wholesale markets, states are thinking about this as well, particularly in how we value solar from residential settings. So when you hear net metering, we're trying to figure out how much value you should get for the generation from your on-site system. And so the key concern here, we can kind of walk through it, it's a little technical, but the key concern is that baseload generation, you flip a switch, right? Coal runs all day long, same consistent amount, whereas when you have wind and solar, the sun's not always shining, right? So if the cloud comes over it, the solar generation goes down, so it's variable. The benefit of solar, though, is that it, generally speaking, follows peak load, right? So as the peak goes up in the daytime hours, the sun is shining, so your solar generation increases. However, when you get to about 4:30, 5 o'clock, right, solar just starts tanking, the sun goes down, and peak continues to go up. So that piece of it is the big concern on how you sort of you solve the grid problem there. One potential way to solve that is with battery storage, right? So if you use battery storage, you can take some of the solar generated electricity you store and then you use it when the sun starts to go down, and that can sort of help serve peak demand. And then the question is, how do you value that in comparison to how you value baseload generation? And that's a big ticket question that NREL considers, as well as states and the federal government. And so that's one of the key things that states are thinking about, as well as grid resiliency, particularly around hurricanes. And you're seeing that in what might happen in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico. We can go to the local debate side, so it's a little bit different on the local side as to what they're dealing with. And that's because local governments deal with different pieces of the puzzle, right? So local governments manage a lot of project development, and that's where municipal code comes in. So I mentioned in a previous slide that cities are talking a lot about solar and these other technologies, but the issue is we don't, it varies a great deal. And so there's a lot of differences in permitting that makes it really challenging for developers to decide where to locate. And the figure on the right just suggests that those cities that do reference solar in their code actually have more deployment than those that don't, and so that might be something that localities might want to consider as well. And then cities can also work on energy and resiliency planning as well. And we're going to go to the next slide because it dovetails with some of the local stuff I'll bring up again. Thanks. But the pathways forward here, right? So in the state side, we're seeing a lot of contention in the legislative space about RPS policies and net metering, and so a lot of these issues are being pushed to the regulatory level. Same thing we're seeing at the federal level, where things are going to the regulatory agencies to decide. And PUCs have actually done a decent job trying to deal with that contention through fostering more collaborative policy development or collaborative settlement agreements that try to come up with better solutions. Colorado is one example of that, something to look forward to. And then to bring up the local policy again, so you know how there's there's thousands of municipal governments out there, and there's a lot of work being done around best practices and renewable energy code and permitting and inspection that local governments are working on together with the lab and others to figure out how best to manage the renewable energy in their jurisdictions. And with that, I thank you all for your time, and look forward to your questions later.
We're going to try another one.
Actually, I was really
Looking
going to
forward to
enjoy your presentation.
Sure, yeah. I'll be sure to mess up a couple.
No.
No?
That's all right. This system has worked, so we're going to keep it.
It's collaborative.
Well, good afternoon. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm actually quite honored to be among so many great speakers. It's been really an educational day for me. I'm coming back to Missoula. I used to live here back in the 80s when I finished planning school. I came to Missoula and worked in the city county planning office for a couple of years, and we thought we'd never leave. but we left. And really haven't come back, and I've had an opportunity to get around town. It looks nothing like it did in 1983, but it is good to be back. So what I'm going to be talking about today is really focused around this idea of social license. So let me just give you a little bit of background about me. So I'm a pracademic. So I do work in collaborative decision making as a scholar, but I'm also working with groups, committees, commissions, task forces, whomever, to make public policy decisions. I'm also an economist, right? So what is an economist doing here? Why is an economist doing work in collaborative decision making? Well, sort of maybe a line that in economics we think about how decisions are made, decision analysis. So that's sort of where I come into this, and sort of what leads me to think about things is that lens of, are we able to make better decisions by collaborating? And that's still something I'm still trying to figure out. So this paper is written with a couple of colleagues, one who is an attorney. She's on our faculty in the School of Environment and Natural Resources. That's Temple. And then my colleague, Jessica Western, also does work in collaborative decision making. So we can switch to the next slide. So really, what I want to talk about, so this is a nice Patty Limerick phrase. I don't know if you've had a chance to ever hear Patty. She's also at the University of Colorado. She's just full of these one-liners. If you ever had have a chance to hear Patty Limerick speak, you should go. It's good. What I'm going to be talking about really is, as they call it in Colorado, fracking, as we call it in Wyoming, hydrologic, we don't use the word fracking. Basically, we've been doing it for 20 years. It just happens to be, if a tree falls in the forest and nobody's around, does it make a sound? So if you frack in Wyoming, does anybody care? Well, we do. But I do want to talk a little bit about sort of where we came in on this one. So the impetus for this was a couple of things. One is we were asked by Shell Shell Corporation to do a study looking at, they were proposing to do they had some leases, oil and gas leases, in the Sand Wash Basin of northern Colorado, which includes both Steamboat Springs and Moffett County, Craig, Colorado. And Steamboat Springs, relies on tourism. Craig and Moffett County, quite a different group of people. They're always saying that they want to secede from Colorado and come into Wyoming. If they did, it would tilt the balance a little bit rightward on the political scale. So they were looking at this as something as, if we're going to come in here and do this work, we want to do it right. So we did what we call a conflict assessment, basically trying to figure out, interviewing lots of people, and trying to get an understanding of, how, what do they think about oil and gas production occurring in their backyard. And of course, Moffett County says, yeah, bring it on, because that's jobs and incomes. And then from Steamboat Springs' perspective, it was a bit more nuanced. But basically, there was some nuance here. And that was, it's conditional, right? So the idea here is that, sure, we'll take oil and gas under certain conditions, okay? So that's starting to get, we were starting to think, okay, well, that's really important and interesting. And well, why don't oil and gas companies do more collaborative work, right? I mean, I think they'd be able to sort of work through some of this difficulties that they're experiencing, particularly in Colorado, if they just convened and worked together to try to figure out under what conditions this could work. So we convened a panel of people in Jackson, Wyoming. And living in Wyoming, one of the things that you have access to are the millionaires and millionaires in Jackson. So we had oil executives who basically have summer or winter homes, depending on whether they like to ski or not. And we convened a bunch of them. So, who we had was Assistant General Counsel to Continental Resources, the head of Iberdrola Renewable Resources, the Vice President Chief of Staff to QEP Resources, General Counsel for Global Litigation for Shell. So some fairly high-placed executives. But the other important part of this was they were retired. Okay, so they were free to speak. So one of the things that we were asking them is, we're talking about, so what is it about oil and gas production that we don't see much collaboration? What's going on here? And this is where the term social license sort of percolated up to me anyway. I hadn't really used it before, and it became sort of the topic of conversation. So I thought, okay, this is interesting. Let's take a look at social license. So that's kind of what I'm going to do. Is I'm going to talk a little bit about social license. So we can go to the next slide. So I'm going to define it. And I'm just, so there are many people that are probably more well-spoken around social license than I, but it's an interesting concept, and I want to kick it around a little bit. I want to talk about incentives for companies to pursue social license, link social license to collaboration. So it's a very one-to-one correlation there. I want to talk a little bit about efforts to achieve social license in the oil and gas sector, broaden the discussion of social license to federal public lands with a focus on NEPA. Let's see if I can do that in the next few minutes. Okay, so this idea of social license to operate, basically it's community consent, all right? So, it's the expectations that emerge from neighborhoods, from conservation organizations, from civil society around what should happen. It's that idea of this, it's conditional, right? So what are those conditions? So to achieve social license, then firms are really attempting to understand what those conditions are and meet those. But it's totally voluntary and informal, right? So why do companies do that? We'll talk a little bit about incentives to do it. But this also idea that it's complex, it's intangible, dynamic, and it's reflective of society's needs or wants. Let's go to the next slide. So social license real quick. So, it's come up and formalized in response to the UN Declaration on Rights of Indigenous Peoples in 2006. And it was really focused around extractive industries, primarily the mining sector. So the mining sector talks about social license a lot. You can Google social license and you'll get a lot of stuff from the mining sector. But it was really focused around this idea of free, prior, and informed consent, which had a little bit of teeth in it from that perspective. But social license is sort of removed from that. Even, we talk about corporate social responsibility, it's even removed from that as well. It's more of well, I guess the key words are it's informal, all right? Let's go to the next slide. So, primarily mining industry, this is something that was interesting to me. So, literature says that it's largely confined to indigenous communities with hierarchical leadership structures. Well, so the corollary to that in the American West are county commissioners, right? And really, I was speaking with the governmental relations person with QEP Resources who said, well, when we went into Pinedale, Wyoming, to open up some of those very large gas fields, we really worked well with the county commissioners and city council in Pinedale. And, Pinedale's got new schools, beautiful recreation centers. This was all done as part of this attempt to achieve social license primarily through a few individuals, primarily county commissioners and city council people. So this idea of extrapolating to more complex social structures, it's not well developed. So we're just sort of seeing some approaches to this in the U.S., particularly in the energy sector. So, legal license isn't social license, right? So one of the things that we think about is, and actually in a previous iteration of this paper, we were really looking at NEPA and these institutional structures as being constraints, right? Companies go, well, you know, we went through NEPA, what else do you need, right? So, but actually I want to talk about NEPA as an incentive for that. Let's go to the next slide. Also this idea of social license sort of supra regulation, meaning that it sort of hangs over everything else and may be used alongside our processes like environmental assessment or environmental impact statements. So let's move on. So what are the incentives? Why do companies even bother? We're also social incentive, protect the firm's reputation, and that really also goes along to economic incentive as well. But you know, we enforce those through public shaming and political pressure. The idea that place matters is that I think you can see oil and gas companies moving in this direction on the Front Range of Colorado, in which public shaming, boycotts, political pressure is very evident. Wyoming, not so much. Complexity matters. The more complex, the wider the scope of these projects, the more apt you might see companies starting to work toward this dimension. Next slide. We also see internal incentives, which are, so managers do this, right? So I saw this come to play pretty well on some work I was doing on ozone reduction in the Upper Green River Basin, in which we had community members and 6 members from large corporations, gas corporations, in which they were highly skilled in this idea of collaborative decision-making. They were helping the community members come along and working with them. So, you know, they had the sort of the managerial organizational culture. Today we're seeing more in terms of organizational identity in this case. Companies are saying, yeah, we want to do the right thing. And in fact, that is the core of our identity. I'm hoping to see more of that. And then this idea of personal commitments and affiliations by individuals within those companies. Next slide. Economics. So basically, economics is the bottom line. And if companies are going to pursue social license, it has to be in their business plan, right? And then strategic. During this conversation we had with the oil and gas companies, one of the individuals basically said, well, you know, social license works because what you're trying to do is work with the local communities, and by doing that, you may preclude intrusion by more organized interest groups. Read National Environmental Organization. Next slide. So this idea of social license incorporates these components. This was written up by Don Smith and Jessica Richards. Don Smith's over in Denver, University of Denver Law School. So trust, transparency, inclusion, ongoing communication engagement, management and accountability. What's this? This is collaboration, right? So this is something that I do know about. So next slide. So this idea that social license and collaboration are really close together, then we can start to talk about, okay, well that makes some sense. So this idea of, all right, let's use collaboration to achieve social license. How do we do that? Next slide. So I want to switch real quickly. So social license in the energy sector right now, you can think about it as happening on the Front Range, but this is going through some very institutional approaches. It's not collaborative. What they're doing is working with local governments working with oil and gas operators to sign these memorandums of understanding. And basically, it does provide some of that social license through these mechanisms. Next slide. So now I want to open it up to public lands. And one last thing that I want to get to. So NEPA is really where we want to focus in on how we can engage in in collaboration on public lands. I want to go to the next slide, even the next one. I want to get to the last one. One more. So I want to introduce this idea of INEPA. So, you know, when we wrote this paper, we thought that NEPA was a barrier to collaboration, but in fact, it's actually it can induce collaboration if done well. and if worked well by entrepreneurial NEPA coordinators at the federal agency level. All right? So this idea of iNEPA is something that I don't know if you've heard about it. It's called iterative NEPA. Basically what it's saying is, yeah, you can include collaboration in NEPA through some various steps as we go into this. Basically, it's recursive. So as long as you are able to document changes in alternatives as we move forward, you can incorporate those changes in alternatives, and those changes come through discussion, collaborative learning, this idea that let's figure out a way that we can make this proposed alternative much better. Then we can do it through this iNEPA process. So lastly, basically, this idea is taking hold in the energy sector. Participatory decision-making is a way to achieve social license. NEPA does indeed present an opportunity for this idea of collaboration. Will we see more collaboration in the energy sector? Possibly, maybe only when social license becomes a necessary condition for operation. Thank you.
All right, well, like everyone else, I want to thank the students at University of Montana. It's been a terrific event, one that I very much enjoyed. It's good to see some old friends and meet some new ones here. I'm going to talk a bit about wildlife conservation, public-private partnerships, and some opportunities perhaps to disrupt common narratives about endangered species in order to foster economic certainty and ecological certainty. So the common way of thinking about wildlife conservation and endangered species in particular is that there's a great uncertainty on both sides of this scale, right? There's a lot of ecological uncertainty. You have a dwindling species who we may not know as much about as we'd like. You have risk factors that may be changing, may be increasing. Certainly development pressure may be increasing. You also have questions about implementation of protections for those species. And then there's also a lot of economic uncertainty that arises out of a listing process. You don't necessarily know what species will be listed. You don't know when they'll be listed. You don't know whether they'll come to begin to occupy whatever land you're on. You don't know what requirements the Fish and Wildlife Service might place on an incidental take permit, on Section 7 consultation and the like. And so what I want to do is talk about the way in which, in the shadow of the Endangered Species Act, there may be opportunities for collaboration. I'm going to do that through greater sage grouse conservation, obviously a controversial, much in the news topic. If I was giving this presentation a month ago, I might have sounded more confident in my conclusions. This week, I feel a little less confident in my conclusions, that we have a success story on our hands. But at least we have perhaps a case study in what may be possible. But to do that, I want to talk briefly about where the legal drivers are under the Endangered Species Act. This will be familiar to many of you. There's 3 provisions of the Act that, to my mind, are most crucial. There's the listing provisions under Section 4, which include a series of mandatory obligations on the part of Fish and Wildlife Service to list species as endangered or threatened based on the best available science, and indeed Fish and Wildlife and National Marine Fisheries Service, if you're looking at aquatic, oceanic, or anadromous species. Neither of them has complete control over their agenda. Right? There is a listing process for petitioning that citizens can initiate with strict statutory timelines, and there's tremendous amounts of litigation that arise, but at the end of the day, it is difficult, at least to my mind, for Fish and Wildlife Service or NIMS, in the face of mounting evidence of a species decline, to resist listing. So then you have the limitations that occur if a listing has been put into place. If there's a listing, either as threatened or endangered, the federal government has both a procedural obligation to consult with the relevant wildlife agency, And a substantive obligation. There's a bar with a very narrow exception on undertaking activities that will jeopardize that species or adversely affect critical habitat. And in the context of greater sage grouse, this Section 7 obligation and that jeopardy limit is particularly important because we're talking about a species where 50% of its remaining habitat is on federal land. Right, so most, and I guess not quite most, roughly most, almost a majority of the habitat is on federal land. But of course, the ESA also has implications for private actors where there is no federal hook. Section 9 prohibits take of species. By regulation, that has been extended to threatened species unless you have what's called a special 4D rule, where Fish and Wildlife Service specifically exempts certain activities from that take prohibition. And the take prohibition, again by regulation, has been extended also to address habitat modification in certain circumstances. And relatively significant, you can go ahead.
Okay.
Relatively significant penalties attached. Now again, greater sage-grouse, relatively high risk if you had a listed species, if the species was listed, of running into take problems. It's a species that's quite sensitive to noise, particularly in the context of breeding. As you may know, greater sage-grouse congregate at these locations called leks, and where there's significant human-caused noise at those locations, say through oil and gas wells, breeding effectiveness declines markedly. So in the context of energy, I'm going to talk a little bit about oil and gas, which doesn't really line up with the alternative energy lens for this panel, but we'll also talk a bit about alternative energy. These are just two maps. On the right, you see greater sage-grouse habitat. On the left, you see the major oil and gas plays in the western United States. Significant amount of overlap here. Right? A lot of the western oil and gas resources are in greater sage-grouse habitat. If we put other mineral resources on that map, you would see additional overlaps in Nevada, Idaho, and Montana. Zooming in, we heard a bit about the Pinedale oil and gas field recently, but this is a map that from the 2008 final environmental impact statement for the BLM Pinedale Anticline oil and gas development. Little antiquated. The reason I'm using it is because I litigated the case defending this, so I'm familiar with the record. But what you see in this map in red are, as of 2006, oil and gas related disturbances. And then the circles surround these breeding locations, these leks. In green is what would occur if BLM had implemented a quarter-mile buffer around leks. Not a lot of areas taken off the table, but a lot of scientific uncertainty that that's adequate. The larger circles reflect what would occur if you put a 2-mile buffer around a lek. Suddenly you see huge amounts of this area becoming unavailable. So that's a component of this uncertainty I'm discussing that I want to focus. Now, of course, oil and gas isn't the only threat to wildlife conservation. Alternative energy can have significant effects as well, both in terms of occupying and fragmenting habitat, in terms of causing direct mortality, particularly to birds and bats and the like from wind, although solar as well, and then also increased predation. When you're running power lines, and this is an issue that we dealt with quite a bit in the Obama administration, dealing with priority transmission lines, you're increasing perching habitat or perching opportunities for raptors, which in turn like to eat things like sage-grouse or desert tortoise. So merely by creating new perching habitat, you can significantly increase mortality. So what was the greater sage-grouse strategy under the Obama administration? On the one hand, in 2010, you had the Fish and Wildlife Service making a determination that listing of the species was warranted, but precluded by other priorities as the language under the Act. And that sort of buys the agency time, although probably not an indefinite amount of time, to postpone formally making the listing decision. Under the Obama administration, once that 2010 finding of warranted but precluded was made, what followed was a consistent effort on the part of BLM, the Forest Service, state partners, and others to come up with a strategy that would avoid the necessity of a listing. Right, and that effort culminated in the Greater Sagebrush Conservation Plan, which was instantiated through 98 land use plan amendments on BLM lands and Forest Service lands across 10 states. Now the plans require a net conservation gain standard, meaning that when activities on federal land were going to be permitted in greater sagebrush, the standard should be more than mitigation, like more than complete offset. And there were sort of two justifications for that. One was the uncertainty that is attached to any effort to mitigate. You don't know how effective it will be. And so there was a thought that if we require net conservation gain as the standard, over time you probably won't have error in the wrong direction such that this listing will be required. And second was the notion that we're trying to improve the conditions for this species. As a result of those plans and relying on those plans, the Fish and Wildlife Service in 2015, it's finding that listing was not warranted because this strategy would avoid the species continued decline. Now, following those 98 land use plan amendments, there were two types of collaborations which I wanted to discuss. The first were continued efforts at federal-state collaboration. And what was the goal was to develop memorandums of understanding, MOUs, that would allow states to develop their own sagebrush conservation programs that would meet the net conservation gain strategy such that the states would have greater control over how sagebrush conservation would occur in their geographic areas, but there would be some certainty that that ultimate standard was met. While I was at the department, a MOU was entered into with the state of Nevada, recognizing the Nevada Conservation Credit System. This is a credit system that Nevada developed to assess debits and credits for activities in sagebrush country and attempt to meet net conservation gain. When I left, there were ongoing negotiations with Wyoming, Idaho, and Montana to develop MOUs. I looked online to see if I could figure out whether any of those were finalized. I was unable to find any announcements about them, so perhaps not, perhaps they're still on hold. I suspect pending the new administration sort of revisiting of the plans. But there were also federal-private partnerships that developed. And in particular, there were two memorandums of understanding entered into with hard rock mining companies, right? Barrick Gold and Newmont Mining. And again, both were with an aim towards creating increased economic certainty for those hard rock mining companies, while also paying dividends on the ecological side and increasing certainty there. The sort of core of the agreements were the identification of a process by which Newmont and Barrick could propose voluntary conservation projects that would enhance habitat on private lands, potentially on public lands as well, things that would be over and above what the Department of Interior could legally require them to do, and then recognizing some system by which credits would be generated by such projects, that the federal government and also state partners could have a role in developing and approving those projects, and then a degree of commitment, although the next slide I'll talk about how much, for the federal government to recognize those credits. And there were two specific systems that were named in the Barrick and Newmont agreements. Again, the Nevada Conservation Credit System, and then also the Nature Conservancy has its own methodology. Now, the federal commitments here, to some of you, may sound awfully flimsy. But there were soft commitments that the federal government made. We committed to consider using the credits generated through this MOU as a NEPA alternative in deciding whether or not to approve any particular service-disturbing activity on the part of the company. We also committed that if we found that use of the credits was appropriate and consistent with law, we would allow them to be used. Pretty squishy. And then 2 commitments related to if a listing occurred. The Fish and Wildlife Service committed, you can put committed maybe in quotations, they committed that if they found the credits adequate to meet that conservation gain, in a particular instance, then no additional mitigation would be required if the companies decided to seek incidental take authorization. And again, if a listing occurred and Fish and Wildlife Service found that credits achieved that conservation gain, then no additional reasonable and prudent measures would be required in Section 7 consultations. Now, I'm sorry, go back just for a second.
Yep.
Now, why commit those commitments so soft? The reason, and this took some time with us and the company's lawyers discussing it, was really to protect the companies. And that may sound counterintuitive, but the concern of mine and other lawyers in the federal government was that if we read these MOUs to be too obligatory, then we would open up the federal government's decision subsequently to approve a project to challenges at that time. Right? If we appeared to have pre-committed to approving any particular mining plan of operation based on credits in an MOU, then an environmental group could bring a successful challenge. And so even though the commitments were less sort of firm than perhaps one might think, the company lawyers understood that this was setting up a framework that would sort of enable collaboration over time while minimizing legal risk. Now, as I said, 2 months ago, I might have ended there. The new administration has commenced sort of a revisitation of these plans. I had hoped, I think I and others had hoped that by creating this process for a collaboration between sort of resource users and wildlife conservation, we might create more durability in the sage-grouse plan. I think that's really up for debate right now. But BLM Acting Director just this week said in issuing a notice of intent to reopen the plans that BLM is committed to being a good neighbor and cooperating with its partners at all levels of government, or referencing states. Sort of interestingly, the governors of Colorado, Montana, and Wyoming have all urged the department not to significantly modify the plans, I think for the reasons of certainty that I've described. And I would suggest that if I were Newmont, Barrick, oil and gas company, or the like, I too would be quite apprehensive about significant modifications. Not only because I would be worried about what new rules might be coming down the pike, probably more favorable if you're a resource user, but primarily because to the extent the plans and wildlife and sage-grouse conservation are diminished, there's significant litigation risk that's going to arise on the part of the United States to defend its decision not to list the greater sage-grouse. And I would suggest to you that many in the business community, I think this is why we created those MOUs in the first place, recognize that increasing costs in a predictable fashion may be substantially better for them than creating huge amounts of uncertainty that make it difficult to make investments. I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you to all of our panelists. I think we can take 10 minutes for questions unless somebody brings out the hook and hauls us away. And I will ask the panelists to return awkwardly to the front of the room. As Professor Panarella said this morning, seemed like it worked pretty well. Someone's phone is right here. Okay. And I'd like to start at the Q&A session by asking the panelists if they have any questions for each other. We've heard a lot of interesting insights about conservation, collaboration, and social licensing strategies, from sage-grouse to other kinds of renewable energy portfolios at all sorts of different institutional levels. So is there any burning questions or comments you have for each other? to start the dialogue.
I just thought it was interesting that we had 4 very different perspectives, but I at least didn't perceive any conflict. Like, it seems to me like you could do everything that we said, and probably they would help in a different ways. So even though they were so different, I didn't perceive them to be, I don't know if anybody else perceived them.
I think that's a fair observation.
The only thing I would suggest is, I mean, we mentioned the collaboration effort that seems to, either it's a memo of understanding, or it's public deliberation, or working through NEPA processes, or a settlement agreement. It's which voices carry the day that matters, and those can vary based on who's at the table, and that's problematic for all the collaborative literature. And so that's the key question. So even if you do have a lot of, you set up a collaborative framework, the question is who's there and whose voices are heard. So that's the only comment to note.
I mean, the only, I think I mostly agree.
Notice you stepped in there.
I stepped in there. I think if I put myself in the shoes of, an energy company that would really like major deregulation of energy development, then I think my model of creating certainty works if you don't think you can amend the ESA. Right? And so it is premised on there being a sort of Damocles, if you will, hanging over everyone's head. And if you think you can get to a point where you can simply rewrite, the law and thus take away that incentive, then you're really you're operating from a different sort of vantage point.
Well, I would say a precondition of collaboration is interdependence. So if a company can do what it wants to do without depending on others, then certainly you won't have collaboration.
And that resonates back on the second panel, right, talking about consultation and whether the tribe has, is there any obligation by the government to listen to the tribe? Can the tribe sue?
Yeah. Do you have any cards, or does one party have the big trump card? Makes a big difference. Questions from the audience? In the back, the salmon-colored shirt.
With regards to social licensing, I'm trying to think of it as a general framework. Like, where will you finally reach a point where where a company or an agency could find that they do have the social license to move forward, or they don't, and they need to continue to work? Where is that,
Yeah, I don't think it's a clear line. And one of the issues with social license is that it's so informal and takes place in these sort of really complex situations. So I would say that you could think about social license as working as long as it works, and then when it doesn't, it doesn't. I can't give you a better answer than that.
Like, with regards to social licensing, I'm thinking of the pipeline, the North Dakota pipeline that went through. I don't feel like they had social license to do that.
Or whether they attempted.
Yeah.
No, very clear.
It seems like BP is an interesting example because they were trying so hard pre-Deepwater Horizon to, I would say, acquire a social license.
Right.
And do the whole thing.
Yeah, it doesn't take much to
Jerry. And then you'll be next. Okay.
This actually follows somewhat from that conversation that is directed to Todd specifically. You mentioned the Midas Gold project right up in the Fayette, and characterized that as the frame as being sort of cleaning up past harms, which I think we should talk about because I disagree. Midas Gold has said that clearly, but maybe not everybody else agrees with that. But to what extent is it really about the fact that it's private land, patented mining claims, unpatented claims, but private rights in those claims, that affects how that frame is created? And would it matter if it were outside of that private rights context? Or does that make any difference?
What I've seen in terms of the public deliberation, it doesn't seem to have really mattered that much. They seem to be working very, very hard to get, almost like a social license there. There's so much outreach in that local community to try to get the public on board with the project.
But it has been challenged twice, the EAs have been challenged twice and withdrawn. And the tribe is opposed to it, right? So,
I'm not saying they're succeeding,
Okay.
but it's at least a more favorable frame, I think, than, yeah, we're a gold mine, what are you gonna do about it?
And I guess my question is a follow-up to that, which is, the Tintina mine going in at White Sulphur Springs, and the rhetoric around that. I don't know if any of you are aware of that or have a comment about how they're trying to win the hearts and minds of the local community. And you guys know about that one? No? No, it's a really interesting, I think, social license that they're seeking.
Which state, where?
It's here, it's in Montana, and
Okay.
it's on the other side of the Smith River and concerns about it. But they've been really working the local community really hard. I think it's one to watch. I think it's really interesting in the context of.
Yeah, one thing about working the community, I mean, you know what that means, right? We can either work the community or we can work with the community, right? And so, the question is, how meaningful is that, right? And to me, this idea of pulling parties together and say, let's have this conversation, says a lot, rather than, oh, I'm going to work with the county commissioners and we'll see what we can do there, right? So there's a big difference, and it really is this idea of collaboration. Collaboration really isn't the oil company sitting together with the county commissioners and maybe members of the city council. Even though the county commissioners and members of the city council say, we represent the public, whether or not they do is an open question.
And I'm really glad you said that, because I was confused by your description of what a hierarchical relationship
Right.
was. So now that clarified
Yeah.
it for me. Thank you.
And I saw a question in the back. Oliver.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask about kind of what the role the agencies are playing in these collaborations, and with the INEPA and kind of the collaborative preferred alternative. Kind of what are they thinking about? Are they delegating some of their decision making to these collaborative groups?
To some degree. So, and I ended it with this idea of it's very entrepreneurial. And I can point to a district ranger in the Medicine Bow National Forest, Frank Romero. This guy will, at the drop of a hat, let's say, let's bring a group of people together, let's talk about it. And he has managed to deal with a really controversial situation, travel management, which makes or breaks Forest Service careers. In his district, he did travel management, and people are like, oh, this seemed to work. No appeals. Next district over, she said, hey, we're not going to involve the public. I know what needs to happen, and we're going to do it, right? So it is very much, any of that work through NEPA, you have to rely on good people at that level to do that work.
Well, one more question?
Actually, it's just less a question than a comment, but I think I was actually a county attorney in eastern Montana when TransCanada was proposing the XL pipeline, and I just think that the experience with TransCanada was very different from the Dakota Access Pipeline in that they really did put a lot of time and energy into gaining that social license, both through the county commissioners who I represented as a county attorney, but also through all of the landowners who were affected in the 5 counties in Montana. And it was a very, very different experience as to how TransCanada approached it as opposed to.
Any comments on that last comment? All right, thank you very much.
My name is Jay Schwaller. I'm the business editor for the Public Lands and Resources Law Review. And it's been such a great day, and we've had so many great voices speaking at this conference. We just like once more to thank Northwestern Energy, Cloud Peak Energy, the Frank and Mary Dustrap Foundation, Rocky Mountain Mineral Law Foundation, the State Bar of Montana Natural Resources Division. This would not have happened without their generous support. We also would like to thank the Dean of the Law School, Dean Kurgis, who gave the introduction this morning, the university staff. There are a lot of people who work behind the scenes on this, but in particular we'd like to mention Kathy Reeves, Becky Garner, Donna Weathers, and Linda Hoover. They all were very helpful working behind the scenes and over the summer to help coordinate so much of this effort. Professors, you've heard many thanks to them, but we're going to thank them once more. Professors Monty Mills and Michelle Bryant, Wes and the IT support, and Nathan Burke for stepping in the last minute and helping with some of the PowerPoint presentations, catering, and then all the PLR staff that have been so diligently working on all the fine details that go on throughout the day, and the shirt shop who made a lot of the wonderful hats and some of the other, those tote bags that you can pick up out on your way out today. And then finally, all of the panelists and the participants, everybody who's had a chance to speak at this. This would not have happened without those voices adding to building this bridge. So just a quick thank you to everybody and for such a great conference. So we've reached the final presentation, and I wanted to say a couple quick words about our last speaker, Scott Slovic. Scott is a highly accomplished scholar, primarily in the field of eco-criticism, which is environmental literary scholarship. He's lectured at over 500 conferences around the globe. When I reached out to him to come speak here, he was about to embark, he was just returning from lectures at the United Arab Emirates, Turkey, and Spain, and he was about to embark on more lectures in Taiwan, Denmark, China, and the always exotic Detroit. I had the honor of working with him in a master's program at the University of Idaho before I came to law school, where he is now the chair of the English department and also helps teach courses for the Semester in the Wild program, which is at a research station in the Frank Church Wilderness. And we were actually lucky to get him. He returned from there last week and will be going back in the next week. So he left one wilderness to come join the wilderness that is a discussion about law and environment. A large part of the conversation about within environmental literary criticism is the idea about destabilizing binaries that exist within how we think and how we talk about literature and environment in particular. And our legal system is especially one that functions in a binary structure, right? We often talk about what happens on one side or the other of the E, right? And in this particular conference, we've been working a little more on bridging those divides on either side of that E. And so I think it just seemed very appropriate to bring in this voice that could bring it all together after so much scaffolding has been put in place to bridge this divide, where we started with Principal Deputy Solicitor of the Interior, Dan Giorgiani, and did such a great job. And now on the other side of this bridge, at the very end of our conference, we have Scott's very appropriately titled Language Matters, Environmental Controversy, and the Quest for Common Ground. So again, thanks to all the participants and organizers, and without further ado, my mentor, colleague, and friend, Scott Slovic.
Well, thanks for that really nice introduction, Jake. And Jake, actually, in the way he straddles studies in the humanities and his current work as a law student, I think actually embodies the bridging of some divides, although to be honest, I don't really recognize these as divides. It's hard for me to see borders. I just see problems and strategies and opportunities to communicate, and hope to share some ideas about language. We've been inundated with fascinating words and concepts all day. I've taken pages and pages of notes, and yet I don't know that we've directly, explicitly, consciously focused on words themselves and why these matter, the different types of language that we use. I'm going to talk a little bit about butterflies today, and I have one of the exemplars of butterfly thinking and butterfly behavior in the Pacific Northwest, Robert Michael Pyle, on this opening slide, the naturalist, lepidopterist, and writer, doing what he loves to do, snagging a butterfly from a meadow and placing it on a person's nose, a young person who may not have thought much about nature and her connection to nature. And so I'm interested initially in my talk in nature as something that brings us together, rather as collaborators and people who really do have a fundamental and inevitable common ground, rather than merely as adversaries competing to be the one to take the butterfly on the nose. So this initial example, which I'll return to at the end of my talk, may seem a little bit out of sync with the focus on North America, but I hope you'll see it as an allegory of sorts that will illuminate the function and the value of particular types of language. Well, I also wanted to mention before I started, speaking of bringing things together and bridging divides, it was interesting to observe the performance last night, and I was a bit bewildered until the final line of Mr. Giorgiani, where he said that we should carry ourselves with humility, share knowledge, and treat people with respect. And I thought, wow, he's channeling the poet Gary Snyder, who said famously in one of his best-known poems about the environment called For the Children from 1974, Gary Snyder wrote, "Stay together." In other words, treat people with respect. Learn the flowers, gain knowledge and then share it, and go light, meaning to have humility in the way we behave in the world. So again, we are indeed all in this together, intentionally or inadvertently. And so the connection between Mr. Giorgiani's remarks representing rather different ideological perspective and Gary Snyder's famous line, "Stay together, learn the flowers, go light," kind of struck me as a flash of people really sharing this fundamental sensibility, although we use different language in many cases. So in 1994, I was a visiting Fulbright professor in 93 and 94 in Tokyo, Japan, one of the most densely populated urban areas in the world, some 30 million people in the land area called the Kanto Plain, roughly the size of Greater Boston. At the end of my year of teaching there, I requested that my graduate students at Sophia University write a small narrative about some connection they'd had in their daily lives with the natural world. And at the beginning of the year, students had told me, "Why are you bothering to teach us about environmental literature in Tokyo? Nature is irrelevant here." And I had hoped, actually, that an earthquake would strike at a moment like that. Something like that. Nature is never irrelevant anywhere, at any time, for any of us who have a connection with the planet Earth. But one young man who seldom spoke in class read a story. I don't remember his name, I hardly knew him, but he told a story that has stayed with me for over 2 decades. He wrote about how he was commuting to class on the typical Tokyo subway one day, where passengers were all minding their own business, as in this photograph that I took from the internet, occupied with books and newspapers and comics. You often see people, adults, reading comic books on Tokyo subways or looking at their electronic devices, essentially ignoring each other. When the train stopped at a particular station, a butterfly flew through the door into the car. And one particular passenger began using his newspaper to try ushering the butterfly back toward the door. As the train continued its journey to the next station, other passengers joined the butterfly rescue effort. By the time the train came to a stop again, many of the passengers were working together, talking to each other to help the butterfly through the door. And when the butterfly had left the train, according to the student who reported it to our class, the passengers continued talking to each other. So, I'm mindful that I'm speaking to an audience primarily of members of the legal community, whether they're students or faculty members or practitioners. And it's particularly wonderful for me to be here with an old friend and in some ways an idol for those of us in the environmental humanities, Charles Wilkinson, who wrote in his book, The Eagle Bird, about the importance of paying attention to language and how often in the law, as well as in any other disciplinary community, people are driven toward a very particular, formal, convention-heavy form of language. And one of the essays that I often turn to in Professor Wilkinson's work from this book, The Eagle Bird, it focuses on the language of the law and how we need to think more open-mindedly and flexibly about this language. He talks about how entering law students arrive using a kind of human language, writing about how they feel, who they are as people in the world, and they're quickly taught to use a more passive voice and dehumanized form of language. And then he also writes in this important essay about the idea that it is still important to use evocative language, humanized, vivid, story and image-filled language, even in some of the more technical kinds of writing that we're offered in legal statutes and in proclamations, such as the one that he shared with us at lunch today for the Bears Ears Monument, that pieces of legal writing with strong emotional language as well as scientific and philosophical content can make a difference. And as Professor Wilkinson was talking earlier, I was noting in my copy of the Bears Ears Proclamation the moments where poetry emerged. And if we'd had more time, I would have engaged in a dialogue about who actually drafted the document and how did that language make its way in, and was any of it removed in favor of other types of language. But I'm fascinated with the persistence of poetry or human language and emotive language, even in technical documents like that. So in my travels, I often have a chance to visit with people who approach environmental topics from legalistic or policy-oriented perspectives. 2 weeks ago, I was in Milan, Italy, at the Italian American Studies Association meeting, and I met this fellow, Graminos Mastroianni, who is a negotiator for the Italian government, travels around the world to places where the Italian Development Cooperation, as it's called, works to mediate between disputing parties on natural resource issues. He had just returned from Uganda. He was bleary-eyed with jet lag and travel fatigue. And over lunch, I asked him, well, what do you do when you approach a group of people who are negotiating on an issue? You're entering the negotiation. I was interested in teasing out any strategies he had to bring the people together in order to facilitate cooperation over disputes over land or resources or borders. And he said he actually approaches these negotiations, such as the one he had just come from in Uganda, actually anticipating that people are keeping things to themselves, secret agendas, and that he feels that bringing to light the areas of conflict will somehow make the parties more honest and forthright in their negotiations with each other. In other words, Mr. Mastroianni assumes that his negotiations will be with adversaries. However, years ago, when I was at a meeting in Mexico City, I met Jerome Deli Pristoli, who is the editor-in-chief of the journal Water Policy and a well-known negotiator, working as a water negotiator for the Army Corps of Engineers for many years, who had this idea. I'm particularly interested in this bottom part where he mentioned over lunch again that what he does when he's about to enter into a negotiation is ask the participants informally and in very small, intimate situations to tell a story about their attachment to the resource or the phenomenon that's under negotiation. And he tends to find that when people use the language of story, they start to see each other as humans, as people who have a shared and legitimate interest in this place, in this resource, and they are much more open-minded and flexible when the actual formal negotiation ensues. Also, in this 1998 publication on public involvement and dispute resolution, in his particular article in this volume, Dr. Pristoli writes about public awareness, meaning not only dispensing of information, technical information from the authorities, from public officials, from scientific experts to the broader public, but the taking in of ideas from the community. And we've heard that repeatedly, what's involved in getting the community to collaborate, to participate, to provide their knowledge through their daily lives or their use of the resources. And that's actually where I'm going to end up. What does it really take in a hands-on way to get the public to participate in these conversations? So I'd like to talk a little bit about narrative as language, storytelling. And in the field of narrative studies, there are many people who focus on the cognitive or psychological aspect of story. What is it about that particular type of language that does something to the speaker and to listeners, or the author and readers, that is different than other forms of language? Suzanne Keen is one of the important figures in narrative studies, and she writes in particular about this idea of narrative empathy, the idea that there's a shared feeling and a sharing of perspective that occurs when we read, view, hear, or imagine narratives about another person's or another being's situation and condition. And also, she writes about a particular type of narrative that she calls ambassadorial strategic empathy, where we tell a story to readers or listeners who we expect to have a different point of view, ambassadorially or diplomatically reaching out to that different perspective in order to bring them into our own point of view. This may make intuitive sense to you, but many people have studied how exactly the empathetic aspect of narrative functions. So years ago, 2004, and the several years before that, I worked with anthropologist Terry Satterfield from the University of British Columbia on a book called What's Nature Worth? Narrative Expressions of Environmental Values, where we met with or otherwise interviewed 12 leading tellers of stories, including such Native American authors as Simon Ortiz and Ophelia Zepeda from Arizona. And we asked them their thoughts about how narrative functions as a way of presenting their own environmental values and eliciting and enabling audiences to develop their own particular sense of values, to calculate their attachments to particular natural phenomena. Bill Kittredge, longtime professor here at the University of Montana, who was one of the participants in this project, said that storytelling invites readers to make up a story of their own, to use the story they're being told as a mirror to which, in which to hold up their own responses to their own concerns. So in other words, there may be certain situations where you're talking with people who have differing perspectives on a topic, such as public lands, and there's a yes or a no. I disagree with you. I have an alternative vision. When you offer a story, the usual response is not a yes or a no, but another story, which doesn't directly conflict, but which complicates and adds a new dimension to the conversation. So the response to a story is another story, rather than a flat agreement or disagreement. So another reason why story is such a poignant and important way of using language is, as psychologists have studied, the fact that our capacity to feel is limited. Our capacity to care, to pay attention, to be engaged with a topic. We are very quickly overwhelmed with information. And so psychologists who study the way we respond to information have determined this quite graphically. This is one of the things my father, Paul Slovic, and I have studied in a book called Numbers and Nerves, Information, Emotion, and Meaning in a World of Data, the various psychological factors that limit or impede our ability to be sensitive to information, and then the way particular forms of communication help us to overcome such insensitivity. So just very briefly, we might expect some phenomena to, such as the value of a human life, to have a stable value. So the values related to human lives increases in a linear fashion as the number of lives concerned increases. Or if we're talking about honeybees and the implications of critical colony collapse, then the larger the number of bees, the more important the value of the lives of these bees. It would be exponentially increasing. The reality about the way the human mind responds to numerical information is that we very quickly lose sensitivity, not when we're talking about numbers of 10, numbers of 50, 100, 1,000 lives, but when we move from 1 to 2. By number 2, there's a marked decline of our ability to care about this phenomenon, whatever phenomenon we're talking about. So take, for instance, the issue of refugees. there were numerous stories around 2014, 2015 about refugees making their way to Europe from the Middle East and Africa, often accompanied by photographs showing large numbers of desperate people on capsized boats floating in the Aegean Sea and elsewhere. Very little public response, very little response in terms of policy from European countries or from the United States. And then on September 3rd, 2015, as many of you will remember, this deeply disturbing, tragic image of Aylan Kurdi, the small child from Syria, lying face first on a beach in the country of Turkey, immediately evoked a tremendous response. People who've studied humanitarian donations have found an enormous spike of concern and charitable giving as a result of that particular image. Now, I would say if Aylan's family members, including his mother and other siblings, had been included in the image, there would have been far less engagement and attention. But the singularity of that one image dramatically increased the attention and the sensitivity of the public. So what does this mean for communication? Well, as we say in the book Numbers and Nerves, citing Edward Tufte, who's a well-known scholar of statistical evidence, what we really need is multidimensional communication, a diversity of evidence that would include not only numerical data and technical information, but also the individualized, emotion-evoking aspects of communication. So think of this in terms of poignancy, and the rough version of the story of the butterfly in the subway. Often when we reduce large-scale phenomena like nature to a single butterfly, people pay more attention. Rather than talking about the entirety of the environment of Tokyo, talking about one butterfly catalyzes that focus. Also, the ability to step back and talk about the larger meaning of the butterfly story is a kind of trans-scalar process that is related to Edward Tufte's idea of multidimensionality. Stories of vulnerability tend to be particularly poignant to audiences. The idea of a butterfly out of place, caught in a subway, is an example of that. And stories that reveal dramatic change, like this group of isolated, inattentive subway riders all of a sudden waking up and working together to remove the butterfly or help the butterfly out, is an example of such dramatic change. So how does this relate to environmental story? Well, Professor Wilkinson earlier mentioned Aldo Leopold, and one of Leopold's most famous pieces of writing in his book, The Sand County Almanac, is the small essay, Thinking Like a Mountain, where Leopold intuitively understands the importance of a singular narrative, focused not on wolves in general or predators in general, but one particular story about himself, a hunting-oriented natural resource manager who felt that it was productive and useful to eradicate predators from a particular ecosystem, encountering one particular wolf pack and ultimately one single wolf whom he shot, and he approaches her just as she's dying. This phrase, a fierce green fire dying in her eyes, may be the single most famous phrase in American environmental writing. He's writing about one wolf in particular that he encounters, and then he talks about his own transformation as a result of encountering that wolf that he was guilty of shooting. But he doesn't leave it there. He then scales up to the broader ecosystemic idea about the importance of predators in a healthy ecosystem. So Leopold is demonstrating intuitively, not really thinking about the use of numerical language or broad scale language and the minute singular scale, but actually intuitively, as many writers do, incorporating this thinking into his work. So Professor Wilkinson, in this essay, Language, Law, and the Eagle Bird, that I again recommend to you, also talks about the importance of citizens taking a much greater role in drafting plans and regulations and statutes affecting the projects they care about, and expresses concern about compartmentalization, particularly in the law, but I would say that many of us are guilty of this in our various disciplines. It's much easier for lawyers to talk to lawyers and for literature professors to talk to literature professors. We can speak in code. We don't have to try to change our vocabularies in order to reach broader audiences. And yet, many of the problems that we're concerned about in the world really do require us to think outside of these rigid categories of language and concept. So I'm interested in how to get the public involved. As I travel the world, as I talk to different groups of people in North America, I find many people who are greatly concerned with their own local situations and what's happening on a broader national and even a planetary level, but they often feel that they don't have the skills, they don't know how even to enter into these conversations. So for for all the people who show up at a public meeting and stand up at a microphone, there are many other people who are silent for various reasons. They never show up, but they have good ideas to contribute. So some of you may know of Frances Moore Lappé of Diet for a Small Planet fame from the 1970s. More recently, in 2006, she published a book called Democracy's Edge, Choosing to Save Our Country by Bringing Democracy to Life, in which she says a healthy democracy requires participation. And my thinking, as I like the concept that we heard in the last panel of pracademic. I'm a pracademic. I don't like to just stay in my office or on my campus. I like to be out interacting with people in the world and doing practical literary studies and communication studies. My perspective is, well, how do we get more people involved? How do we generate more conversations? And so she talks a bit about story. We need stories. We need words to tell them. You'd think that all of us have the capability or the experience to tell stories, but I would argue that that's not really true. Many of us don't even really know exactly what a vivid, poignant story entails. And when called upon to tell a story, we're at a loss for how to begin. So this idea of getting the public involved is also reinforced in this 2012 book by 3 generations of the Taylor family, the youngest of whom is a colleague of mine at the University of Washington in Seattle, an ecological literary scholar who works on 19th century British literature. But these 3 generations of Taylors in their book, Empowerment on an Unstable Planet, talk about the fact that everyone in the world, no matter their education level, his or her education level, or their financial status, everyone has a kind of intrinsic power and an ability to participate in a social movement and in a social conversation. In fact, and this is, I'm not really focusing on energy in this talk, although much of my work in the past has actually emphasized the literature of energy and the humanistic dimension of energy discussions, but they actually invoke energy in this book, Empowerment on an Unstable Planet, when they talk about Gandhi as a social organizer managing human energy in a way that is the equivalent of Einstein's thinking about physical energy, because he was able to galvanize the Indian public before they pushed out the British colonial regime and essentially topple, without a war, the dominant colonial power of the day. That's power for you, that's energy, but it's not related to kilowatts. It's the energy that is intrinsic to all of us as people. And a lot of it has to do with telling a powerful story and letting the public know that they can participate and have work toward positive social change. Sometimes this storytelling, particularly at a public gathering, is very messy and requires a lot of time. Maybe there will be no immediate resolution or any resolution. One example of this is in a book by James Galvin, the poet and novelist from Wyoming and the University of Iowa, who in his book, Fencing the Sky, in a favorite chapter of mine, on a public meeting regarding lands of the Rocky Mountain West, brings together ranchers, environmentalists, people who are newly arrived and hoping to buy some land and build a ranchette. And during this meeting, all we get is, well, an academic comes and facilitates the conversation by giving a lecture about the human impact on the environment. And then there's a free-for-all with no commentary. And in fact, the chapter ends with this rancher's statement, we want to live on the land and take good care of it. I'm not complaining, I don't mind the work of ranching, just let me do it. I don't mind being invisible, I just don't want to disappear. But there's a kind of sympathetic and humorous and raucous array of different voices in the room. And it suggests, and the lack of a resolution in this chapter and in the entire book suggests to me that we really need to live together for a long time and find ways to communicate with each other and not expect a quick result to public land disputes. The idea of empowering the public, though, is related to what I consider related to the movement called bioregionalism. I mentioned Gary Snyder earlier. On the San Juan Ridge in the Sierra Nevada mountains, Gary Snyder and his local community have a very active bioregional collective working together with the California state government to try to manage the forests of that area. So bioregionalism, a movement that emerged in the 1970s, mostly California-based, but gradually finding footholds in various places around North America, really is about local empowerment to participate in, if not absolutely control, the management of local resources. And this is related to the phenomenon of environmental testimony projects, which have emerged particularly in the context of wilderness protection. I think the trigger for this entire movement was the book edited by Stephen Trimble and Terry Tempest Williams, published in 1995 and delivered in a limited edition copy to every member of the House and the Senate in order to support protection of wilderness in southern Utah. And since then, there have been many other wilderness testimony projects, including this one that I helped edit with a national park ranger from Great Basin National Park in Nevada, the idea of eliciting a variety of voices. And maybe because of my idea that public voices tend to be diverse and often in conflict with each other, but to have a comparable validity regardless of perspective, this particular book has 30 different voices, ranging from Native American perspectives to scientific perspectives, those of environmentalists, and people who really argue against the protection of wilderness in Nevada, officially declared wilderness. And that kind of raucousness, I think, is inevitable in many of these public discussions. But I believe the discussion is the important thing, not coming to a quick resolution. In fact, I like the example we heard earlier of the approach in Burundi of getting the negotiating parties together for a 5-day retreat prior to the beginning, as I understood it, of the formal negotiation. That's kind of what it takes. Get people together, allow them to know each other, take walks together, share meals together, trade stories, and eventually you reach a point where you can have the more formal discussion. Well, as a scholar of writing and a teacher of writing, one of my goals has been to try to do workshops in various places in the US and around the world. This actually is in Malaysia with a group of students from 6 different countries. This is a Nigerian man standing up and giving personal testimony after a 3-day workshop. And the idea is to tell people what a testimony entails, like a 5-minute presentation, and what you would do if you wanted to present a statement that would have some impact and enable people to understand where you're coming from. He's talking about his concern about desertification in northern Nigeria, and he's a professor or a scholar of literature, but he's learning how to be an engaged citizen in this particular situation here. So I've offered, as an academic, 9 of these workshops in the past several months for different groups of people, including Native American elders from Tri-Cities in southern Washington to just local people from Moscow, Idaho. I do this all the time with my students in the wilderness, in the Frank Church River No Return Wilderness, and here are students presenting their testimonies a year ago out there in the Frank Church. So the goal of such workshops such as this is one on the island of Guam in the spring of 2016 with a group of people, 25 local citizens, some of whom were academics or students, others of whom were just local citizens who heard about the opportunity to come and practice environmental writing. The goal of this is to empower participants such as University of Guam undergraduate Ariel Lowe, who had not been particularly focused on environmental topics, but was a slam poet. And she came to this workshop, wrote a poem about the rhino beetle, which is devastating much of the vegetation on the island of Guam, and immediately put it online. And now it's on YouTube, and it's on the University of Guam website. So people find new ways of getting their voices out to the world, not just by showing up at a formal public hearing, but by using social media. Also, to guide regular citizens, the goal of one of the workshops is to guide citizens to pay attention, simply to pay attention to the world and develop confidence in their writing and their potential for public speaking based on these empirical observations. Here I am at an Earth Day event from last spring where one of my colleagues is telling the participants how to keep a journal and how to write their observations down. And another workshop last April where we brought citizen scientist, expert, and writer Sharmin Abdrussel from Silver City, New Mexico, to lead a workshop on citizen science. Also at conferences, we can train our colleagues to do a kind of writing that's not entrenched in particular disciplines, but reaches out to broader audiences. This workshop at the Association for the Study of Literature and Environment Conference last summer was proposed to me by Nalini Nadkarni, ecologist at the University of Utah, who said, well, let's get an ecologist and a writer together to lead a workshop to build teams of scientists and writers who can then go on and present important science to the broader public. And this is a workshop that I offered a couple weeks ago in Islamabad, Pakistan, to a group of people, mostly students and professors on the women's campus of International Islamic University, who were involved in starting a new organization for the study of environmental humanities in that part of the world. I saw very little of Islamabad. I was kept under tight security. I never touched a street. I was either in my hotel, which had 3 bomb checkpoints on the way from the road to the front door, on the campus or in the airport. But I did walk out in the garden of the campus with this group of students, and they participated in a writing workshop, and now their comments about the vegetation of Islamabad are making their way to an international database on people's responses to botanical phenomena around the world. So they're also getting their ideas out into the world. So I'm just about at the end here, but you remember my bare bones summary of the story of the butterfly, or cho in Japanese, in the Tokyo subway, which is what I recall specifically from my students' response to the writing assignment back in 1994. In my imagination, though, the story has taken on vivid details and symbolic significance. This is what stories do. We craft them from raw material of our lives, the raw material, and they in turn work on us, flowering in our imaginations. I imagine the train passengers on that subway car back in 1994, salarymen and salarywomen dressed in austere black suits and skirts, each in his or her own world, indifferent to fellow passengers and to the natural world. The Tokyo train system, like train and subways and highway systems in other urban areas, is what theorist of supermodernity, Marc Auger, calls a non-place, an anonymous, featureless, interchangeable realm that defies emotional attachment. But as my students' brief story takes hold in my imagination, I picture the initial scene of isolated individual people changing. The butterfly, not described in detail in the original story, takes on bright color as butterflies do, perhaps the rusty orange wing stripes of a vagrant American copper, sometimes found in Tokyo, or the faded blue of a milkweed butterfly, perhaps the speckled brightness of a marbled fritillary. As this erratic speck of brightness enters the train car, The stern and isolated human passengers gradually come alive. First, one man, perhaps my student, notices the butterfly, and a small spark of concern lights up in his mind. This small, delicate being must be helped to fly back out into the world. He takes a newspaper and uses the wing-like pages to guide the butterfly toward the door of the car. But butterflies dart left and right, up and down. It's how they move, whether in a meadow or on a subway. So the student needs some help in his efforts. Other passengers stand and move toward the activity, wielding their manga, cartoons, comic books, or their music players, or simply their hands. The individual effort becomes a team effort. In the dark subterranean maze of the Tokyo subway system, sparked by the presence of a butterfly, a human community was born. Together by a small, delicate piece of nature, what Alison Deming, the poet, has called a fluttering scrap of paper. I hope that we can learn to use our various attachments to the natural world, attachments all of us have in one way or another, and our stories about such attachments to build bridges between us, in some cases bridges that may be codified by policy and law. We all share this planet with our fellow human beings and with many other beings. We need this planet, and future generations will as well. Let our stories of encounters with the more than human world be the connective tissue that reminds us of our dependence upon each other and the planet. Thank you.
That concludes our conference programming. We wanted to echo the gratitude for your wonderful participation, listening, and contribution. And we will see you in 2 years for our next engaging Public Lands Law Conference.
Thank you, everyone, for showing up and contributing to what has been a great event. And we do hope to see you in 2 years, but hopefully before that, too.
Yes. All right, on your way out, stop and meet one of our public land students if you haven't yet. They're fabulous.
And they have merchandise for sale, too. so.